Hello, we'd like to welcome you to another night and session of the greatest books. Tonight we have with us Ann Lassiter, back from Medjugorje, from Eastern Europe, from the Balkans. Excited, returning as a pilgrim from the East. Ann, welcome to Trinity House, and we're glad to have you with us again tonight.
Well, thank you. I always love discussing anything that comes to mind with you, because you have such a broad frame of reference and such a real good choice of words and opinions and things. It's really wonderful to be able to do that. And tonight we're talking about your previous, three or four of your previous lectures, are we not? In fact, tonight's deal was that you were going to you began by concentrating on the works of Aristotle, and you brought in the fact that you had sort of made an interpretation and compendium of his works, in which you had discovered that he had some very clear rules for good government. And I thought maybe we could start off by talking about that. For example, you were talking about what is the best government. You said everybody has a government because man is a social animal, and we always gather in communities, and this is true. The larger the family, the tribe, the clan, the community, and those people all need some sort of governing order. So if you tell us a little bit about, your idea of what government is. Aristotle's maybe.
Sure. Well, I think that question is answered pretty clearly when we lay out the functions of government, or the purposes and functions of government. And as you said, human beings are social animals, meaning we must live in groups to, one, survive, and two, to flourish, right? To be nourished and flourish, right? To reach our ends as human beings. Those ends which we defined when we studied ethics as being happiness by acquiring the virtues, which are the means to the end of happiness. Well, if the human end is happiness, and we must live in groups to pursue that end, then government is necessary to regulate life in those groups. And then we say, well, what kind of powers and authority must that government have to help promote the end of human development, or the maximization of our human potentials? And so that becomes the framework by which we look for the ends of government, which would be some of these, such as the government must provide for the common good. I think that's probably the primary function, because the common good means each and every individual and the whole group together, the whole commons, and every individual who makes up the commons. Because you and I are individuals that make up the commons, that go into making up the commons, and we're both equally human beings, and so is everyone else part of that commons, equally a human being. And they came into this group to have their human dignity nourished so they could flourish as well and reach their end. So the common exists the government exists to promote everyone's rights and liberties to achieve their end. Not one or two or a group or this group or that group, but every single human being. So that's the fundamental function of government, to serve the common good of every human being and the total community. Then we say, well, how do you pursue good? Well, you have to have peace. No one can pursue happiness with war going on.
I noticed that this may be a little aside, but I just got back from Medjugorje, and I was at the top of the mountain, Kristovic, which has two pieces of the true cross in it, incidentally. The cross on top of that mountain does. And anyway, I looked down, and this was a valley between two ridges of old, burnt-out mountains that had been in an earthquake, and it was very difficult to get where I was. In fact, I'm never going to try it again. But at any rate, I looked out, and the whole valley was prosperous looking. The fields were green, and there was machinery to take care of the fields, and the houses were all slate roofed and new and painted, and there were some cars, not too many, but the Medjugorje, by being at peace for 10 years, has brought tremendous prosperity into that region. And of course there were also 26 million American pilgrims, many of whom were Americans, so they did have an inflow of money, if you will, the tourists, but still it's peace and prosperity.
Yeah, I think that's a profound insight.
Yeah.
You must have peace first. That's the fundamental need for all of us, to have peace, but not just peace. I think you're going much deeper. What you said, I see much deeper than the surface. Peace, I mean economic peace, I mean peace over a hamlet. But how does peace come over a hamlet? How does it come over a village? How does it come over a countryside? How does it come over a state? unless there's first peace in the interior
Right.
of each person, back to that individual person. I'm at peace with myself, and I'm at peace with you because you and I are friends. And because we're friends, Aristotle said friendship is one of the needs in a state. And our friendship leads us to love one another. And we love and we forgive and we're reconciled. So if I'm functioning as a human being at peace with myself, willing to love you and to forgive you and to be reconciled with you, and in a community is like that, this is a political powerhouse. And then people can grow as human beings, and their human nature can just unfold, can flourish, can blossom, and together they can work and build up a community. But as you say, that's reality. There is the need of capital. There are hard facts. And capital isn't flowing perhaps from the West through pilgrims, but that capital is presumably being used for the benefit of that community.
It is obviously being used for the benefit of that entire community.
That's a beautiful example.
And that entire valley is prospering as a consequence.
Tremendous.
It's beautiful. It really is a beautiful sight to see. And when you started talking about Aristotle's need for peace, it reminded me of the consequence of peace,
yes,
which is prosperity.
And peace is more than, as Pope Paul VI said, peace is much more than the absence of war.
That's right.
That's the first thing we think about peace, the absence of war. But you're talking about something much deeper than that.
Oh yeah, these people are all working together and raising crops and building houses and taking care of tourists and doing all sorts of things that lead to contentment, if you will. And so peace does have contentment in it as well.
Yes.
You know.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. That's beautiful.
Yeah, right. Well, I was glad to, because it fits in with Aristotle's definition. We were talking about how man is always flawed and always endangered by other members of various groups. And of course, there they had that war with the Serbs, the Croats and the Serbs, and Mary's presence there and people's prayer toward her seemed to have resulted in the peace that they had for, at least in that area. They've still got a lot of disturbance because the Balkans are always in a chaotic mess.
Now, even with that kind of peace, there would still be need for government from Aristotle's perspective.
There you are.
Because you have to coordinate all these people's activities. 100,000 people, a nation of 1 million people, all with different gifts and talents and abilities. Even though they're at peace and are harmonious, they have to be organized most efficiently so the fruits of that community can be used most efficiently for the benefit of that community and others whom they might serve. So government is even necessary in a state of peace to coordinate and to make life efficient.
And to keep things functioning, you're right.
To keep it functioning, to keep the peace, to protect the borders, to promote coordination and efficiency.
Right. You also in your talk, to get back to our discussion, you were talking about Hesiod and his conundrum, or at least what I call a conundrum, and it's what is it better to do, to know or to do? And so which is the best good, to know the good or to do the good? And I thought you made a very fine explanation of that. Would you sort of go over it a little bit for us?
That's an awesome point. I love the point, right? The question becomes, which is better, to know the good or to do the good?
Right.
Well, obviously, before that we stated the best is to know and to do both.
Right.
But if given the choice, right, to know or to do, which one would it be? Well, Hesiod says it, as we said in the lecture, this way: best is he who knows all things himself. Good is he who hearkens when wise men counsel right. But he that neither knows nor lays to heart another's wisdom is a useless wit. So best is he that knows and does all things himself. But good, below best, not best, but good, he who hearkens when wise men counsel right. The presumption is the good one doesn't know, but has snuffed brains to listen that when wise men counsel right. Consequently, that person can go in the right direction even though they don't know it for themselves. But he who neither knows nor lays to heart another's wisdom is a useless wit. Good to know one. So the Greek presumption, if represented in Hesiod, and Aristotle would agree with that, I would agree with that, I think it's pretty obvious, that it's better to do the good than to just know the good. Because the person that knows and doesn't do isn't going in the right direction, no good to anyone. But the person who doesn't know and moves in the right direction is a benefit to themselves and to the community, even without the knowledge of why it is they're doing this. One thing on that, though, before you go on. See, although that's good, the philosopher would say that person who is listening to the wise men hearkening right, that's a good act, but it's not a human act. See, to be a human act, you have to both know it in your mind yourself and then will it, because those are the human powers. So the one who's acting right is acting well, but not acting humanly, not acting as a full human being, more like an animal, being compelled from someone else's wisdom or someone else's power or force or authority. A good thing, but not the best thing. That person presumably will have to mature. And ultimately, if they're going good, they'll be habituated to the good, and one day have a mind, because the passions are under control, that can discover the good and then direct themselves. Then it would be a full human act. They both know and they do, then they're the best, not just the good.
Oh, I see. Well, you know, that is one of the parts of your conundrum that really needs more of is because how do you get to know something without being taught it, or just even through reason? You know, you were talking about Aristotle's shortcomings. He didn't have anything except gods that were mock stereotypes of humans. Really. Anthropomorphic, right? That's exactly right. And so he had
image of man, right?
Made in the image of man. So he had no way of reaching outward or upward. Plato did a little better than he did with his forms of the true and the beautiful, but Aristotle, about whom we're concerned for government, did not reach those heights. And so, how does one know what is good?
Well, the way Aristotle would know what was good. Before you answer that, let me make sure, because I see two levels operating here.
Okay.
There's a basic answer to that question, and then the problem: how do you know the good in a culture like the Greek culture?
There you are.
All right, so the way you know the good, Aristotle would say, is through reason. Through reason. Normally, that reason is buttressed or supported by some kind of faith or some type of religion. And so you can know the good two ways. We said this way back in the beginning when we talked about methodology, science, and philosophy and religion. Remember the ways human beings know? So you can know it through your faith, if that faith matches your reason, or you can know it through reason alone. Aristotle operating with reason alone. So that's his answer, through reason. But at a deeper level, I think you're asking what we're talking about in the lecture there, is how does any human being know the good? How does anyone know the good they're supposed to do if they can't figure it out for themselves?
Right.
And the answer was, of course, we said, the law. Good men make good laws, and those laws help people to know what they should do, even if they can't figure it out for themselves. The conundrum becomes when we ask the question, well, where do we get these good men from? That's where the mind gets boggled. That's where the clarity stops, and we're forced to think hard and have to really say if our thinking to this point has been correct, and I think it's correct, that good men make good laws, but we said people need good laws to help them to become habituated to do good. You can't do good without knowing what the good is, but you can't know the good without doing the good first. So how do you do the good without knowing it? Through good laws. But how are those good men to make good laws? How did they know the good? How did the first one know the good? If he didn't have laws to guide him there. We said human nature is corrupt, human nature is flawed. And so we would expect a human being with a flawed nature without law or a community of law to guide him or her to the good would do the bad, would act like an animal, wouldn't act like a human being. But that's not what happened. Somehow we have good law. Where did it come from? That's the question?
Yeah, it is. And actually you were working on that pretty well when you were talking about parents and the natural authority of parents and the counsel of the wise probably being the parents at that point. And then just have a body of law built up within the community.
It would begin off in the families.
Yeah.
The family is so key and essential to the building of a peaceful, just, society of human beings flourishing and pursuing happiness. The family. That's the first law given by the parents. But then, because the family is not a perfect society, the political philosopher says it's not a perfect society. A perfect society is one that has all that it needs to achieve its ends. And the family doesn't have all that it needs to achieve the end, the human being to achieve their ends. The state, we say, is a perfect society because it has all it needs to achieve temporal ends. And so this human being as part of a family is part of a larger community called the state, which is regulated by the government. And so the government next becomes the order of lawgiver after the family. And the government, like the family, has to have good laws to guide us to our ends. because the family is insufficient for that purpose. So the family and the state must be working together, must support one another. Like when I send my children to school, I hope the teachers are backing up the lessons I'm giving my children at home. And if the schools are presumably run by the state, if they're not doing what we're doing at home, then we have a conflict between the state and the family. We have a fundamental flaw and breakdown in our social system. So law must be good in the family and in the state.
Okay. And then you were talking about the difference between the right to rule and the might to rule. And you mentioned something that I know people don't talk about much, and that is the Trail of Tears. So I thought that was a very wonderful example, and also an example that we need to take to heart, that even in a country such as ours, which does have a lot of consideration for all sorts of minorities and other people, even in a country such as ours, we can do some things that are very bad. The people who had the right to rule was the Supreme Court in this case,
Yes.
John Marshall,
Yes.
and the people who had the might to rule was the president.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
That's right.
So what happened?
Well, let's back up.
I mean, you said it in the
Yes.
lecture, but let's repeat.
Well, let's
that.
look at that before we answer that question. There's one ancillary point. We said there are three places that law could come from, and we identified those as instinct, will, and reason. We eliminated instinct because that's a law for animals, not for human beings. To be a law for human beings, it has to be of the mind and or of the will. So we're left with two answers. It's of the will or of the mind. If it's of the will, then it's not a dictative reason. It's an emotion. It's the whim of a person that's moved to do something that might not be reasonable. We see that in this action, right? We have a whim of the president being moved by his will, not by the Constitution, not by the valid authority that interprets that Constitution in the United States, which is the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice being John Marshall. So we have an act of the will going against the act of the reason of the Supreme Court's decision-making power, and you have might makes right, because the president had the executive power. He had the power, and his power gave him the ability to do what he wanted to do, roughshod over the Supreme Court
And the Constitution.
and the Constitution. But he got away with it because of the power that he had. And it's important to point out in this case, historically, it's not, I don't know if that could happen today. If it happened today, there would be all kinds of turmoil in this country.
Yeah, right.
Remember when Chief Justice John Marshall, he was the third Supreme Court justice. And when he took over the Supreme Court actually met in the basement of the White House.
Oh, is that
His
right?
predecessor quit the job because it was a nothing job. That court was weak compared to the other two branches of government. It took a genius like John Marshall, the precedents he laid down in Marbury versus Madison, Cohen versus Virginia, McCullough versus Maryland, other cases, great landmark decisions. The man was a juridical genius, and he gave that court some power it didn't have when he took office. So it's historically he had a weak thing to begin with, and the president might be able to get away with it in those days. I don't know if President Clinton or President-elect Bush could get away with that today, because that would cause a big backlash across this country, which didn't exist back in the 18th century.
Okay, and what it was that they did was they forced President Andrew Jackson forcibly moved a tribe of Indians from their normal home, their natural home, to a place across the Mississippi, which was not fertile, which was not used, and which they did not know how to handle, and they were dragged without their possessions or anything, forcibly like slaves or something, across the country, after John Marshall had said that it was unconstitutional for them to do that.
That's correct. That's
right.
Exactly correct.
Okay,
so that's the Trail of Tears, and a
That's
perfect
the Trail
example
of
of just saying,
Tears.
of a might makes right,
Right.
an arbitrary law of the will, and that's what happens when it's not guided by reason.
You're right, and it happens a lot, I know. In other countries, certainly Russia
Yes.
indulged in that for 70 years without any reason or justice or
Well, it came from a certain ideological perspective.
Right.
We would say the Russians were at least consistent in operating from an ideological perspective of Marxism, Leninism, but then we have to question, as we said, the principles which is guiding their thinking.
Uh-huh.
And so it comes down to that, and this Aristotelian approach to politics, really, if the best government was the mixed and the best form is law, how do we get that law and the principles of those law? Those principles have to be correct. It's very important to get those principles correct, because then even after that, you could have a constitutional government. The communists had a constitution, right? But if the principles are incorrect, enshrined in that Constitution, and we're adhering to the Constitution, what good is that? That might as well be arbitrary rule of the will as well.
Yeah.
Because it's principles of the will that are in that Constitution, not principles of the natural law or of reason.
Okay.
So we have to be careful when we enshrine those principles into the Constitution.
Well, I would like to talk about subsidiarity a little bit more, because you brought that up. We've talked about it a lot in the past, but I don't think people really understand the term or the use of the term in government.
Okay. I think this term subsidiarity is very relevant as you bring it up, because when Aristotle was talking about government, we laid out 7 basic functions of government. We would call that today limited government. And he had a limited view of government. It was not the welfare state. It was not a socialist state. It was not a capitalist state turning to a welfare state. It was limited, more like the libertarian perspective. Libertarians argue for limited government, and that they're Aristotelian. Not that they're Aristotelian in the rest of it, but they're Aristotelian in the structure of limited government, the functions of government. When we, as subsidiarity in the Catholic tradition, is also linked up with that idea of limited, small. The principle comes down to that, to this: those units of governance, those units of economic life, political life, social life, the labor union, the self-help club, the co-op, all those groups, those clubs that human beings form, if they can govern themselves, no higher form of government should take the functions of a lower form of government. It should always devolve to the lowest local level, because the local people know best their needs, and it's their life, after all, that's involved. So they're best motivated to use their potential powers and wisdom to solve the problems that they have in front of them. That's the traditional definition. But there's one more part that usually gets missed. See, because we all argue about subsidiarity, devolving it, local control. That's true, with one caveat, one big caveat. And that big caveat is if the local people are competent.
I see.
If the local people are competent. That's a big caveat. That's a big beware. I mean, you don't just throw it down there and say, you local people can handle it. The question is, are the local people able to handle it? If they're not able to handle it, by default it goes to the next higher level.
I see.
So if you find a government where you have big government, we can't presume immediately that that's wrong. If we're in a country where the lower levels can't do it because they're not competent, because they're selfish, because they're greedy, because they don't have the wisdom, because they don't have the virtue, because they don't serve the common good, it devolves by default to the next level. So we always want to ask ourselves.
It goes back
it goes
up. It evolves up.
Yes. That's what's missed, Ann, when people speak about subsidiarity in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm not advocating up or down. The definition I would like to see go, actually I'm advocating down. Devolve it down. That means we need to educate people there. Community colleges. Okay? We need local education. We need local education for leadership, for citizenship, if we're going to be truly practicing subsidiarity. Don't tell me about subsidiarity and fail to give us higher education at the local level where it's supposed to happen.
Okay, well, I'm
a little excited about that, because
we probably should take a minute or two to talk about the forms of government.
Mm-hmm.
Because Aristotle suggested 6.
Yes.
And for various reasons, none of them worked too well. He suggested the monarchy, which degenerates into a tyranny. He suggested an aristocracy, which degenerates into oligarchy.
Yes, very good.
He suggested democracy, which degenerates into democracy. But he ended up with a suggestion for the best leftover stuff,
yes.
Right? And so would you go ahead and describe that a little bit? The best representation form of government.
I think we do that very quickly. Obviously, we want to get rid of the devolutions, the corruptions.
Right.
That makes tyranny, oligarchy, democracy are out of the picture. Leaves us 3. They're all dismissed because they're unrealistic. You can't find one perfect virtuous man. You can't find then 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 of them. So they're all dismissed. So we're left without an answer to our problem. So how do you get an answer? Well, he realized in real practical life, human beings do seek their selfish ends. Human beings oftentimes, if they're not virtuous, if they're not raised properly, will seek their selfish ends. They're not fighting against
Probably
that.
not educated either.
They're not educated to do such a thing. So in reality, that's oftentimes the case. And you have poor going against rich tugging against poor, middle people not being represented. So in Aristotle's perspective, the middle class, the middling class, if it's the largest and oftentimes is the largest group, They need to be represented. The poor need to be represented, and the rich need to be represented. It's almost an idea of solidarity, a cohesiveness, all the units functioning together. The problem is it's not really solidarity, because in solidarity, it's my group, the poor, fighting for the rich fighting for the poor, the middle fighting for everyone else. We're concerned about each other, not me, you, against each other. But if you have a situation where it's me, you against each other, which is often the case, it's best to balance them into a mixed form of government. So the poor can't take from the rich, and the rich can't take from the poor, and the middle are represented. And one other key point, he said, in reality, the leaders are oftentimes or usually not much better than the citizens, those who follow. And in that situation, the citizens should be listened to. They should be involved in political decision making, at least through voting somehow, some kind of having a voice. If it's through representatives or voting, they should have a voice in that government. But if you have a case where the leaders are so virtuous, so over head and heels more virtuous than everyone else, then we would have the type of leadership that would defer to the aristocracy or to the monarchy. But that's so rare, and it devolves always. Consequently, we're best mixing it up from the beginning, balancing it as we did in the American Constitution.
Okay, then that's the Constitution of checks and balances.
Exactly.
That's so famous at this time.
So that's 2,000 years old.
Oh boy, and that's right. Aristotle did it 2,000 years ago, didn't he? Well, I have several things here that we need to talk about. I would like to talk about. One is that you were talking about government being soul and structure. And we haven't gone into soul yet. So you said good men make good laws. So if you would talk to us a little bit about that.
And I think that's the most important part. The part, again, that usually gets missed. When people talk about best form of government, they usually talk about, tell me what's best. Democracy, oligarchy, monarchy, Aristotle, what's the best? And they think when they have the answer mixed, they have the answer. That was the mistake I think our founding fathers made. They came away with the best structure, but that's only half of the equation. What's the best soul? What's the best law? What vivifies and gives real life and sustenance to the structure? And that becomes down to good law. Aristotle says good men made these good laws, and the question is then where do you get good men? In the United States, we defaulted on the question. Madison made a political virtue out of selfishness. He just defaulted. He assumed human beings were selfish. So in the fact of human nature being corrupt and selfishness, how do you make government function well in the absence of good men? Make a structure of checks and balances and forget about making good men. Aristotle would have said, make a structure of checks and balances and worry about making good men, like they did in the Polish Constitution. Do both, right? Then we can have soul and structure and a strong government.
Well, I think you're aiming that way when you're trying to educate people in not only in the classics but also in the council of wise men, because that's what education is. It's teaching the council of the wise men that we've had over the thousands of years
and
that
women.
We've had. Well, yes, right. But when I say men, I mean it's generic. I use men and women. You're right. Okay, and that's the counsel that we should, that we can't miss. So we're talking about things like positive law as an application of as a function of interpretation or use of the Constitution. Is that correct?
Positive law is specific derivations from the principles of the natural law. Natural law is up here, principles. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. But we come down to the actual application of those laws to concrete particular cases, which have all kinds of differences. The laws have to be understood differently at the local level, at the positive law. How I define murder might be different now than you define murder. So we say the positive law is the specific derivations of the natural law, which are enshrined in the Constitution.
I see. Well, so we have one Constitution that you used, was the Polish Constitution, in which human beings and their education were raised up to a higher level of interest in the Constitution.
And there we see, Anne, the very example of structure and form, because the Poles wanted the best structure, and they also wanted the best form. They said the education of the king's sons was a state interest, a national interest. They needed the type of education to fit them for leadership. And everyone else needed the education for citizenship. They both need education. However, the education of the king's sons is paramount, special education. The kind of education we advocate here with the Kolbe's Greatest Books program, that's for everyone, all the citizens. We'd like everyone to have that, even leaders. But we realize that the leadership has to have even another level of education. That which we talked about when we discussed the liberal arts back at the beginning, and said there's a type of thinking at the level of natural intelligence, and that's acquired. the political leader should have scientific intelligence, wisdom, plus moral virtue to lead us. The citizens just need to have, they need to have intelligence. They don't need to have necessary wisdom. They need to do the good, and they need to know the good when they hear it, and they need to hear the voice of truth and follow it. But they don't need to be philosophers and scientists. So education is necessary for everyone, but the leadership requires a special education, and we're not doing that in the 21st century. We're not providing special education for leadership. We're just giving everyone the same thing, and therein is a mistake, I think, in politics.
You know, I think that was a wonderful point that you just made, and I really think it's the key point to our discussion this evening, because you as an educator are aiming at trying to reach the consciousness of the actual people, to bring them into a political consciousness, a good government consciousness. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Ann. And on to piggyback on that, then we'll close up here. The American Academy of Liberal Education, which has become a large accreditor of liberal arts colleges throughout America today, makes one of the hallmarks of liberal education citizenship. It's one of the marks they insist upon. And this is what we're hitting upon in our discussion of politics tonight and its relationship to liberal education. Citizenship and education that makes life meaningful because people can participate in their own governance. And so, Anne, we'd like to thank you for this really wonderful discussion tonight. And again, always come back. And good night, and God bless everyone else that's been listening.